The sun was just beginning to set over the small American town of Cedarbrook, casting long orange rays across the streets and making the windows of the old diners and gas stations gleam like warm gold. It was a peaceful-looking town from the outside, but like many small towns across the country, it held quiet tensions just under the surface. People waved to each other on the sidewalks, but there were stories hidden behind those smiles. That was the day James "Jimmy" Walker, a 67-year-old black Vietnam veteran, decided to take a road trip back to his childhood hometown after nearly 40 years away. Jimmy had served honorably in the United States Army, completing 2 tours in Vietnam, and though he had returned with scars both visible and invisible, he had always held his head high. His hair was mostly gray now, his shoulders slightly hunched, and his brown skin bore the marks of age and sun, but his walk still carried that quiet dignity that only those who have faced life and death on the battlefield seem to possess. He drove an old Ford pickup, the kind that rattled when it went over a pothole, with a worn American flag decal on the back window and a sticker that read, "Vietnam Veteran, Proud to Have Served." His plan was simple: drive the long highways, listen to old blues and Motown on the radio, and stop in small towns to grab a cup of coffee, stretch his legs, and maybe talk to a stranger or two about the old days. By the time he reached Cedarbrook, Jimmy had been driving for hours and his knees ached from sitting so long. He spotted a quaint gas station on the corner of Main and Birch, with a small convenience store. Attached, a red and white awning, and an old-style neon "Open" sign flickering in the window. Out front, there was a bench where a couple of local men in baseball caps were sipping sodas and watching the world go by, their conversation stopping as Jimmy pulled in. He was used to the stares. A lifetime of being a black man in America had taught him to notice but not always react. He parked, stepped out slowly, stretched his legs, and walked into the store to use the restroom before refueling. Inside, the store smelled faintly of coffee, gasoline, and the sweet tang of candy bars. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s, thin with a sharp jawline, wearing a plaid shirt and a trucker hat that read, "Cedarbrook Proud." His name tag read Rick. He watched Jimmy walk toward the restroom at the back of the store, and his voice cut through the air like a sudden gust. "Restrooms for paying customers only," Rick said, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. Jimmy paused and gave a polite nod. "No problem, I'll grab a coffee after. Just need to use the bathroom first." Rick's lips tightened. "Nope. You gotta buy first. And we're kinda keeping the restroom for locals these days. Too many, travelers making a mess." His eyes lingered on Jimmy in a way that made the message clear: you don't belong here. Jimmy had seen this look before, many times, in many towns. It wasn't about restrooms, it was about who he was. He took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I'm a veteran. I've been on the road for hours. I just need a minute, and then I'll buy whatever you want me to buy. I've served this country, and I'd appreciate a little respect." Rick crossed his arms. "I respect our vets. My brother served. But rules are rules." Behind Jimmy, the door chimed as a young white couple entered. They walked straight to the restroom, and Rick didn't say a word to them. Jimmy noticed but bit his tongue. His pride told him to walk out, but his body reminded him he didn't have the luxury of driving another hour to find a restroom. He turned back to Rick. "Sir, I noticed you didn't stop them. You saying the rules just for me?" The store grew quiet except for the buzzing of a soda fridge. Rick's jaw tightened. "I don't like your tone, old man. Maybe you should just move along." Jimmy felt a deep, familiar heaviness in his chest. He'd fought in a war for a country that still sometimes treated him like a stranger. He thought of the times in the 1970s when he'd come home from Vietnam wearing his uniform and still been denied service at diners. He had hoped, after all these years, that things would be different. He could have left quietly, but something in him, the soldier, the man who had endured too much to be invisible, wouldn't let it go this time. He pulled out his phone and started recording. "Sir, are you denying me use of the restroom because I'm black?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Rick's face turned red. "Don't you pull that card with me. I said rules are rules. Buy something or leave." The older men on the bench outside peered in curiously, sensing a commotion. Jimmy's voice stayed level. "I'm a veteran. I served this country. All I'm asking for is the same respect you'd give anyone else. You let that young couple in without buying a thing." One of the older men outside, Harold Green, a retired mailman and lifelong Cedarbrook resident, stepped inside. "Rick, what's going on here? This guy's making a scene," Rick snapped. "He's got a problem with our rules." Harold looked at Jimmy, then back at Rick. "He's a vet, ain't he? You lettin' kids in to use the restroom all the time. Why you giving him trouble?" Rick stammered, but before he could answer, the young couple emerged from the restroom, eyes wide. We didn't buy anything," the man said quietly, realizing the tension. Jimmy simply said, "Exactly." By then, a small crowd had formed outside, drawn by the murmurs and the phone camera in Jimmy's hand. Among them was Lisa Morales, a local high school teacher who often advocated for community inclusivity. She recognized Jimmy from the Veterans Memorial Ceremony the town had hosted 2 years ago. "Mr. Walker," she said, stepping forward. "You were at the memorial service, right? You told that story about your platoon in Da Nang." Jimmy nodded. Jimmy interrupted softly but powerfully, "The only attitude I have is the one this country gave me, to survive, to endure, and to keep standing, no matter how many doors get slammed in my face." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. Jimmy's words carried the weight of decades, of battles fought overseas and injustices endured at home. Harold shook his head slowly. "Rick, this ain't right. Let the man use the restroom. And you oughta apologize." Rick hesitated, his pride battling with the eyes of the community and the cameras pointed at him. Finally, he muttered, "Fine. Go ahead." Jimmy didn't move right away. He kept his gaze steady. "And the apology?" Rick's face burned crimson. "I'm sorry." Jimmy nodded once, then walked to the restroom, his dignity intact. By the next morning, the video had gone viral. Local news outlets picked it up, with the headline, "Black Veteran Denied Restroom in Cedarbrook, Community Reacts." Calls flooded the gas station, some supportive, many angry. Veterans from across the state drove to Cedarbrook to stand with Jimmy. Angela Carter, a city councilwoman from a nearby town, came to meet him personally and promised to draft a local ordinance preventing discrimination in public accommodations. Days later, the gas station owner, who had been on vacation during the incident, publicly apologized and announced mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. Rick was quietly suspended for a month. But for Jimmy, the true victory wasn't punishment, it was awareness. He had spent decades being quiet about injustices, but this time, he had made people see, and he had made them listen. A week later, the town hosted a small ceremony at the Veterans Memorial Park. Jimmy was invited as the guest of honor. People who had never spoken to him before shook his hand, some apologizing for the way he had been treated. Lisa Morales introduced him to a group of local students, and he shared his story, not just about Vietnam, but about the battles that came after, battles that didn't involve guns, but dignity. Respect isn't something you should have to beg for, Jimmy said to the crowd. I fought for this country because I believed in its promise. But that promise doesn't mean much if we don't honor each other as equals. As the crowd applauded, Jimmy felt a quiet sense of peace. He hadn't wanted a confrontation, but perhaps this was why life had put him in Cedarbrook that day. Not to use a restroom, but to remind a town, and maybe even the wider world, that the fight for respect and equality was still not over, and that one man's quiet stand could ripple far beyond four walls and a locked door.